Thea Chesney joins us tonight to present her talk, Ice and Fire, Spring Fruiting Mushrooms in the Mountains. Thea is a resident of the Sierra Nevada foothills. She developed an interest in mushrooms at an early age that has grown into an obsession. She earned her degree in forestry at UC Berkeley and is now doing field work for the US Forest Service as a botanist, teaches workshops, and is working on a field guide for the mushrooms of the Sierra Nevada and other mountains in California. Welcome, Thea.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for the invitation to speak to MSSF, which is a group I've been around and about and a member of for a long time, since my time in Berkeley. So happy to be back, albeit virtually. It'd be much more fun to see all of your faces in person. Welcome. Let me see if I can get my screen share going pro internet connection. So I'll be aware that there's probably going to be a lag in changing slides and things like that. So hopefully things will remain stable. If not, I may have to pause and we'll go to an alternate cell network, but hopefully it'll work.
Yeah, it might help to,
all right,
to switch your video off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I will. Controls. All right. Thanks again for having me. So I'm going to start out with just a little bit of the background, my introduction to me. I work for the Forest Service, and I'm actually just recently have accepted a new job also with the Forest Service, which will not allow me to travel so much. But here's what I did for 10 years. I traveled around to all those dots on the map and got paid to survey for plants at these permanent plots. It's a 23-year long study that's still running, and it's allowed me to see a lot of the California mountains during the growing season. And funny thing about getting paid to look at plants, that means I have time to look for mushrooms as well. Incidental mushroom looking while I'm working. I introduce you to kind of a couple of different zones in the Sierra Nevada, and I think I've included these slides in almost every talk I've given, just because I don't expect everybody to be that familiar with the trees and the ecology of the mountains of California. So lower to mid Montane forest, this is where probably many of you are familiar with it, and you might come in the spring to look for morels, for boletes, just to walk around in the woods, and it's close to home for me. And in the upper Montane forest, this is mostly where I spend my summers. And some of you have also probably spent plenty of time hiking around up here too. So just kind of the cast of characters as far as the dominant plants that we'll see. And noting that in the upper Montane zone, everything is adapted to very heavy snow loads. So being buried under snow for a good portion of the year. And as you're probably also aware, that isn't always the case anymore. So that kind of puts a different spin on things, but we'll talk about that a little bit as we go on. I can't talk about snowbank fungi without talking about William Bridge Cook, because he was really the first to recognize snowbank fungi as a unique ecological group. And he described this ecological niche Fairly early on, for the first time in his publication on the fungi of Mount Shasta, and then later on in a more detailed exploration of snowbank and alpine fungi. So these are kind of the characteristics, and this is something that really William Ridge Cook was the first to write about. So this is a group of fungi that's unique to Western and mountains in North America. It's not a group that occurs really elsewhere in the world. There are some close relatives that occur in other parts of the world, but they don't seem to form as distinct a group as they do in Western North America. And we're talking about species from all over the fungal family tree: ectomycorrhizal species, saprotrophs, so those decomposing wood and other organic debris, also some fungal pathogens. And one of the neat things about these is that some will start to develop while the snowbank is still completely covering them, and then they'll start to melt the snowbank as they grow. I'll show you an example of that a little later. But these are some of Cook's diagrams from his Subalpine Fungi and Snowbanks publication, where he really did some meticulous charting of the edge of the snowbank and charted out soil temperatures at various points away from the snowbanks, and then recorded fungal fruiting bodies. And you might notice that some of the fungal names have changed. Actually, most of these names have changed, but they are fungi that we pretty much recognize today. So let's talk about some of those. But first, we're going to talk about the other main source of knowledge about snowbank fungi in the Sierra Nevada, and that is the Yuba Pass Field Campus and the fungi course that was established by Harry Thiers in 1982 and has been held most years since then. I'm sure that some of you have been to this course. I hope others of you will perhaps attend this course in the future. I think it is being held again this year after a hiatus for COVID. But because this course has been held almost every year during the same week, it's always the second week of June, more or less, and because it's a rigorous course where students have time, microscopes and lab equipment to actually study the mushrooms that they're finding, we have this really long-running and fairly comprehensive list of fungi, and that's a really unique and pretty wonderful resource. So if you haven't been, I highly recommend that you consider attending. It's fun. Remember how I said that some fungi start growing underneath snow and then melt snow around them? This is a beautiful example of such a thing. And it's a photo that a lot of you probably have seen because I was there with Noah Siegel and Christian Schwartz, and we all took photos of this these two beautiful mushrooms. We couldn't help ourselves. So yeah, Lassen National Park with mountain hemlock. So this is an example of an ectomycorrhizal fungus, hygrophorus, that's associated with the roots of living mountain hemlock. Yet it's restricted to coming up when the snow is melting. And that really is the primary source of moisture for the mountain hemlock groves during the year. It's the spring snow melt. And another photo, just because it's pretty, it's pink. And this actually shows the waxy gills. So like all other hygrophorus, very thick, very waxy gills. And the mushrooms in this photograph have the indignity of being transported in a little bit of snow in my hands 2 miles back on a trail because I didn't have my camera with me. So a little different fungus from a different part of the fungal tree of life. We have these little goblets, these little cups. Donadinia, nigrella, you may have learned them as Pectanian and Feltii. Absolutely jet black, just a couple inches tall, very small. and growing on woody debris in and around melting snow. Then we get to another kind of gilled mushroom. This one's a wood rotter, it's a foliota, and this one never fully opens, which is a trait that we see a lot in montane fungi. We see many different species, again, from different evolutionary groups, starting to close up and no longer forcibly releasing spores in every case. I think this one still can, but as you can see, it's often really, really convoluted fruiting bodies, and it just has this thick skin, thick peridium that just covers the gills, even into maturity. Other times, it can have a thinner veil, and you can see some of the gills open up there. But like other semi-secotioid or semi-closed up mushrooms in the mountains, this one has a very strong odor. And I describe it as somewhere between wintergreen and like acetone or toilet bowl cleaner, but there's definitely a wintergreen component. Some people say more, like bubble gum plus chemicals. It's a fragrant mushroom. And here's what I call a beautiful, good spring day when the snow is melting. This is taken on the Tahoe National Forest. It's not too far from where I live, although up in elevation. And all of these organisms were showing themselves beautifully on the same day. So yes, I got to look at some flowers and see a few fungi. This Cortinarius, yes, still a Cortinarius, even with the recent split you may have heard about. Cortinarius flavobacillus, named for this yellow base to this type. It's an innate yellow color there. And it's a little telemonia, and it is a good name from Western North America. It was described from Western mountains. And occurs pretty widely and very shortly after snow melt or while the snow is still melting. This little goblet over here, another little cup fungus, I'll talk more about it a little bit later, but it grows on sedges. So I just made up the common name sedge goblet. And the steer's head flower really also grows usually within a few feet of melting snowbanks and persists for a little while afterwards, but it's a very early spring flower. So one can indulge multiple kingdoms, multiple attractions to different kingdoms on the same day, if you're lucky. That's what makes it so fun for me. I get to not just look for fungi, not just look for plants, also looking for birds, different ecological groups. It's great fun. I'm just going to go through quickly a couple of other species that we may run into as the snow is melting in the mountains. This is Pycnoporellus albolutius when it's young. It starts out white or nearly so, but as you can see underneath, it's starting to develop some orange tones. And in age, it becomes really kind of funky, powdery, and more or less completely orangish. And we have our little jelly drops, jelly cones. These are really, really common. So if you've ever looked for fungi in the spring in the mountains, you've probably seen these on twigs and smallish diameter wood. It can be on larger diameter wood as well. And you might even see these later in summer if there are thunderstorms and more rain, because these can rehydrate pretty easily as soon as they get a little water. One day in 2017 on the Eldorado National Forest, I encountered a couple of species in a pretty small area. And so I just laid them out all together here. Geomitra montana, and Phytothyrsia vernalis, named, of course, for Harry Thiers, very punnily, as one might understand if one knows Latin. And then on the same slope, but a little higher up, where there was less snow because more sun, found this Melanoleuca and Cleistocebi vernalis. And Melanoleuca is a very poorly studied group, certainly in the Western North America and also elsewhere in the world. So I'm not going to put a name on that. But the Cleistocebi is a pretty cool little mushroom. It looks almost like a dingy waxy cap. And I've only seen it a few times. It's not terribly common, but it can be really kind of abundant when it's fruiting, when the conditions are right. So it's a little oddball. I like it a lot. And this one should be familiar to anybody who's spent time looking for morels in the mountains. This is the blue staining orange cup that you'll find very commonly, usually a few weeks before the morels appear in any given location, because they can start going when the soil is still a little bit colder. And this I include both because it's really common and because it's an example of a pathogen. It's considered to be a seed pathogen. In literature from Europe, I believe, it's described as growing on the seeds of spruce. Locally in California, we don't have spruce in most places. It's probably on fir. As you can see, the dominant needle litter in both of these photos is true fir, Abies. So anyway, you can find this around melting snow, also a little bit later, but it's always a fun, cheery one to see. A few weeks before what a lot of people start this. This is, Morchella snyderi. So morels are not really snowbank mushrooms, although sometimes you can go out looking for morels and run into snow and find morels in the snow. And it'll be interesting to see what happens this year, because we've had such a dry winter with very little snowpack. But if we get more storms, we could well end up with snow coming in as the morels are starting to fruit. Who knows? And stranger things have happened. And I keep track of some of the different morel species I find, even though some of them don't seem to be described. This little one I tend to find under picnic tables in campgrounds that are still closed for the season. So just a little fun thing to keep eyes out for. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I spend a lot of my working time in meadows and in fens. And for those who don't know, a fen is a peatland. A lot of people conflate them with bogs, but fens are continuously saturated. So any decomposition that's happening is anaerobic. There's no oxygen because things are just constantly underwater. And so therefore the rate of accumulation of organic matter is greater than the rate of decomposition. And so we get peat, and peat can be formed by sedges and other plants, not just peat moss, sphagnum, but we do have sphagnum fens in California too, which are very fun. And just because I will share a little bit more about one of the fungi that comes up in the spring, often very soon after snowmelt, in some of these wet meadows and fens. So this, as I showed you the photo of before, it's Sclerotinia sulcata, and grows on last year's flowering stalks of sedges. of Carex species. It seems to, in my experience, only grow on one group of sedges, but that's really nerdy, even for botanists. So I don't expect anybody else is keeping track of that. On the right there, you can see I carefully excavated one of the sclerotinia from its sedge home. And that long black thing is all the sclerotium of this fungus. So that is the resting stage that formed the fall before this came out to fruit, and basically rested under the snow all winter, and then was ready to go to spring forward and into life as soon as the snow melted off. So it's a pretty cool adaptation, and we have a number of species that look kind of like this. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, as I was saying, there are several species that look the same, and most of them are fairly poorly known. But yeah, at least 3 or 4 things that at a glance look identical, but have differently shaped sclerotium, different sizes. They're all out there waiting for somebody to figure them out. And then there's a much more brightly colored species that tends to draw the eye of those slogging around in bogs and fens and wet meadows early in the season. Mitrula elegans, or something close to that. And this is one that's fairly reliably found in a couple of spots, mostly one spot up by the field campus at Yuba Pass that's been dubbed Mitrula Marsh by the regulars there. But it also, yeah, it's popped up a number of times, and because it's in wet spots, at least spots that are usually wet, it can start growing as soon as the snow melts, but it can also continue growing into the summer. So here's the 15th of July. The snow had long since melted off in this meadow, but still water, so there's still growth. So at this point, I'm going to switch gears from talking about things that love the wet and the snow to fire, and to fungi that are adapted to fire. Some of them we know and love, others are a little less well known, but we're dealing with fire a lot these days in California, and the fungi are too. So first I'll talk about another specific ecological group of fungi that are adapted specifically to fire. And this is a group that's known around the world, and either the species themselves are very widespread, or we have a lot of closely related species in different parts of the world that are doing the same thing. So they're variously called, pyrophilous fungi, carbonicolous fungi, anthocophilous, or something, I like phenocoid as of the phoenix. And you'll see these roots, all these Latin and Greek roots in names of fungi adapted to fire. So these fungi are particularly well adapted to some of the specific effects of fire, namely the ones listed here: heating and nutrient flush with a pH shift, and also removal of litter, death, organic matter, and death of plants around them. So this can provide an opportunity to kind of colonize a radically different space for these fungi. The removal of competition means a lot more available water, but the fungi have to be able to handle the conditions that cause the fire and the fire itself. So some of the adaptations here are pretty obvious, and they're somewhat similar to as organisms use as well. So I showed you the sclerotium of the sclerotinia that lives in sedges, but some species that follow fire also form sclerotia in order to make it through. Others have really thick-walled spores. Dark spores are really common. Fungi produce melanin. This is animals do, protection from radiation, from sun and heat. Some species can step up their processing of nitrogen and phosphorus, which can come in really handy to take advantage of the sudden nutrient flush after a fire. And still others seem to be able to shift their nutritional mode, or at least have their fruiting triggered by the death of the plant host. That's, you know, kind of a classic example, morels. You know, fruit, you know, after the trees around them have died or are dying. But there are other species of fungi that do this too. Here's just a particularly nice photograph, microscopically taken by Fred Stevens, showing dark and very thick-walled spores of this little brown mushroom called Crassisporium funereophyllum. And if you spend any time at all looking at spores under a microscope, you will recognize that these are thick-walled. If you haven't, you'll have to take my word for it. They are pretty extraordinarily thick for fungal spores. I'm not going to spend too much time on fire ecology because this is not my fire ecology talk, but living in California, I think we should all be fairly aware of a few things, and that is that the way fires burn has changed a lot in recent years. It's changed a lot since 1849, and pre-1849, we were seeing a lot more frequent fires and a lot more low intensity fires. And these were both ignited by lightning, but largely ignited by native people who used fire and still use fire to manage the landscape around them. So that's something that, you know, it's just something to think about. And then some of the changes that have happened over the last 150 plus years have led to this huge increase in fuels, mainly because of the suppression of fire, but also because of land management practices. So our fire regime, as we'd say, or the way fires burn, how they burn, when they burn, these have all changed pretty radically, and we're still seeing these changes play out as our climate warms up and as fuel buildup, you know, keeps increasing in some places. I want to just show you this slide again, just because it's a forest that's managed with frequent prescribed fire, about every 5 to 7 years. And it's hard to find forests that look like this in a lot of places in California. You can see in this photo in the background, you can see some black oaks. You can also see that there are some denser patches of trees that have not been thinned out, but in the foreground, it's very thinned out. And you can see there's some young trees regenerating. There's widely spaced older trees, and that's just a forest structure that increasingly land managers are trying to recreate, but you know, in most of our lifetimes has not been a common forest structure at all. Why do I mention forest structure and trees and fire? It's because I'm very interested in how fungi interact with these conditions, with these changing environments. And again, I'm not going to go over this in too much depth, but thinking about fungi associated with the roots of living trees, mycorrhizal fungi. You know, how do they deal with fire? And obviously fire severity really, really matters, because if you have complete death of the plant hosts, of the tree hosts of fungi, they're not going to do so well. And if you have a less severe fire where the trees and the dominant vegetation might survive, at least in part, you're still going to have some fungi that don't deal with fire very well and others that do better. And so some will have an advantage. Others will, you know, drop out for a while and maybe come back. But this is something that I think about a lot, is how, you know, how have our fungal communities changed based on the way fire has been managed and the forests have been managed over the last 150 years, and how will they continue to change in a very rapidly changing California, or writ large the West Coast. Fungal succession is something that I think we really need to be thinking about more. And I put in here rarity of species because how we think about which fungi are common or rare is in some ways very much limited to a point in time, or we think of it as limited to what's rare or what's common right now. And so how has that changed over time? You know, what's common now might be just what has managed to survive the radically changing conditions. We might have lost species that we never knew about. But that's something, there's a lot of research to be done there. Other folks are working on some of these questions. But I do think about that a lot. I'm going to mention a little case study here. This was research conducted by the Friends Lab at UC Berkeley. And this is a case study of Rhizopogon olivacea tinctus. And it's a little truffle forming fungus. It's associated with pines, bishop pines primarily. And it's a kind of a little, was a little mystery because its spores were there, but people hadn't collected it, at least not very commonly. And it wasn't showing up in rodent scat. And rodents, of course, are the primary consumers of a lot of these truffle-forming fungi. So even if people were not collecting them because people are bad at finding truffles, you would think if this fungus was fruiting, that it would be found by the rodents and show up as spores in rodent scat. But that wasn't the case. So it seems like in an unburned bishop pine forest, this thing was in a spore bank, but it wasn't colonizing the roots of the pines. But after a fire, turns out it colonizes pine seedlings really effectively. So what these researchers did is showed that they basically simulated fire by heating up pine seedling roots and heating up the spores of this Rhizopogon, and actually creating little mini fires as well. And basically showed that there's very little colonization of pine seedling roots without heat. But if you heat up the soil with the seedlings roots in it and the spores in it, voila, you get a lot more colonization of the roots. So this is obviously a fungus that's really well adapted to fire because it apparently requires heating to kind of activate the spores and make life happen. So that's a happy fire adapted fungus. If you've ever been out in a burn zone, I'm sure you've seen this little orange kind of pimply crust out there. Pyronema is usually one of the first fungi to fruit after a fire. It can even be coming up just a few short weeks after the fire is out. And it's definitely an opportunist. And I think a lot of these fire following fungi are more opportunistic in terms of when they fruit. You'll find sometimes you'll see them in the fall. If there are fall rains and then there's been a burn, you can find them coming up in November and December if it's not too cold. You can also find them quite handily in the spring. And there are a couple of kind of extreme examples where they're just moisture dependent. So they are dependent on the fire, and then they're dependent on having enough moisture to fruit, but they're not so time sensitive as some of the things that are associated with melting snow. This is an old picture. This is from the King Fire, but I like it even though it's not entirely in focus because there are 3 fire following fungal species that I can see in this photo. And of course, one of them being morels. That little Crassosporium funaria phylum that I showed you, Fred Stevens' photo of the spore, that's there, that little nondescript brown cap. Here's a little bit one of those kind of oddball fruitings that I was talking about. Things are not just found in the springtime. It's just the 1st of September. Why not? We got a little bit extra moisture, a fire that had burned through the previous year, and living trees, and a seep. So why not fruit? Now, morels, at least in California, don't seem to be quite as happy to take advantage of moisture at any time of year. I know in Arizona, people have reported finding morels in the fall, and I think rarely in California, but it's not terribly common, probably because most of the time it's just too dry. But we can expect to find fire following morel species a couple years after fire. After 2 to 3 years, they start to kind of fade out and be replaced by the non-fire adapted morel species like Morchella snyderi, Morchella tridentina. But it wouldn't be a talk about spring fungi if I didn't talk about morels. So there you go. Another on the just kind of nondescript brown gill fungi, but this one's the Foliota and the Brunescens group. And this is a low elevation species. There's a more slender slender species that grows up in the Montane forests. We call that one Foliota highlandensis usually. But yeah, another really common thing to find after fires. This is Damon's photo from iNaturalist, and I love the purple cups against the orange Anthocobia, the smaller cups there. It's just a really pretty color combination, and he managed to capture the purple, which often these purple pizizas or geocyphas aren't quite as purple in real life, at least not in my experience. I'm going to show you another oddball one to kind of finish up with. And this is Christian's photo. And this is a very strange species, and people have mistaken it for cauliflower mushrooms, for sporassus before. And people have, I think, quite understandably mistaken it for an overgrown stump of a morel. But yeah, it used to be Pisiza proteana. Now it's known as Dahliamyces phillipsii, and seems to be pretty common after fire in coastal forests. Not sure that it's so common in the mountains. I don't think I've ever seen it, or at least I don't think I've ever seen it in the mountains in shape that I could confidently identify it. That doesn't mean it's not there. It's just I haven't been there at the right place in the right time to see it. So there's always more to look for out there. And one more, it's not a mushroom, but it's a very, very pretty flower. And I'm a bot nerd as well as a mycologist. So there you go. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Tia. That was a wonderful presentation
Thank you.
with a lot of information.
Yeah, there's a lot to it, and I was just trying to try not to overwhelm, but I get excited about these things. So
Tia?
yeah.
There evidently was a fairly long-term study with known sample points prior to the rim fire.
Yep.
The rim fire swept through, and so there was before and after data collectible because all the study points were GPS, they could relocate them. Could you talk about that some?
Yeah, I can. And this is, again, research that a lot of it happened at the Bruns Lab at UC Berkeley, and Sydney Glassman worked a lot on this.
Who was that?
Sydney Glassman, I know, worked some on this data set, and I'm not as familiar with the results as I probably should be. But yes, they definitely had, it, I think, showed some interesting patterns and changes post rim fire, which, as most of you probably remember, was a pretty high intensity and very large scale wildfire. So yeah, I would expect that if plots had been placed out in other forests and then had similar intensity fires, like really intense, like the Dixie fire, the Camp Fire, any of the recent fires, that you would probably have seen somewhat similar results. But without that research having been done, it's a little hard to tell.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could take a look at the chat and perhaps answer some questions from there, and unless anyone wants to take it. Let me pull up the chat here if I can. And I'll start. Okay. I'll start here with a question from Stu Pickle. When's the earliest you'd start looking for snowmelt fungi, and at what elevation do you start? You can start anywhere at any time. And it's, I hesitate to give a date because it's so variable. I know it's hard being on the coast or in the city to know what's happening up in the mountains. But, use the intelligence that you can, or, send somebody to scout. And it's when there is moisture, start looking. And this year, the snowpack's been so dismal in the Sierra Nevada that I'm not sure how much we'll really get in terms of snowbank fungi, but with more storms, that could change. So I know in this storm that just came through last night and today, the snow levels were pretty high. So areas around 4,000 to 5,000 feet were getting rain, which is good. Snow would be better, but that'll lead to just some different groups of fungi popping up probably. So my answer to where do you start looking for snowmelt fungi? Wherever there has been snow. And just start low and work your way up till you hit a snowbank. Or another alternative is to drive up as high as you can until you can't go any further because of the snow, and then work your way back down the hill. So, okay. Teresa was asking, can you share more about fruiting dates and schedules in the spring? Is fruiting more strongly linked to soil temperature, day length, moisture? Fruiting is linked to all of these things, and it's very dependent on each individual species. But moisture really rules them all. In the mountains in California, moisture is always going to be the limiting factor, especially as we don't have as much snowpack, don't have as much of a moisture buffer as we historically have had. So certainly there's some obvious cases, like between the Calocypha, the little blue staining orange cup, and morels, the Calocypha can obviously start at a lower soil temperature. And the same goes for some of the fire following fungi. Some tend to pop up earlier, so when the soil is still colder, others wait a little while until the soil is warmed up a bit. Day length probably plays a role, but I don't actually know if anybody's looked at that in the context of our Montane fungi. I think moisture is just too much of a driver from other things to have that significant a role. And then Ken's question, how do you feel this lack of spring rains have affected the fire following fungi? It's not good. Let's just say that. My crystal ball for this year is cloudy, and we're still, I was in a pretty deep funk until this last rain came, as I'm sure a lot of you were too. Hoping that this rain will produce some fruitings down at lower elevations, and I'm really hoping we get some later snow that'll keep things going longer in the mountains. But I could easily see this being another year like, last year, 2016, 2015, 2014, 2013, where what snow we did have, in a lot of cases, just evaporated too quickly for many of the fungi to fruit. And we didn't get any spring rains to prolong things. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking, but temper thy expectations, I think, unfortunately. Oh, Clement Irving had a question about Hygrophorus marzuolus. Is this a species that can be found in Sierra Nevada forests? Yes, probably. It definitely occurs up around Mount Shasta in the Modoc and the Southern Cascades. I've not personally found it in the Sierra Nevada, but given the kind of habitat that it likes up in the Southern Cascades, I don't see why it couldn't be there. And it's, by the way, bound to be different than the European Hygrophorus marzuolus. It's just the name that we're using. Kenichi is asking, are some fungi using cues other than moisture to know when to fruit? And this is kind of similar to Teresa's question. And yes, they are using other cues, but I'm going to just say again that the moisture is just such a dominant cue that it may kind of overrule everything else. Cues from plant hosts, plant phenology, that's absolutely critical as well. It's a little less important, I think, with conifers, because they're at least able to photosynthesize and, you know, kind of go at any point. They can photosynthesize when it's warm enough throughout the winter as well. With deciduous trees such as, you know, like oaks, for instance, I think it's a little bit more of a big deal. I know in my yard, which is not in the mountains, it's low foothills. No matter how much moisture we have in February and March, the little helvellas that come up under my valley oak come out when the oak is leafing out. So yeah, they're definitely relying on signals from the trees, just some more than others. Dan,
Tia, years ago there was a big fire at Salt Point, mostly on the west side of the highway. And is that the area that information about the rhizopogon came from?
The rhizopogon study, I think, was more based on point rays, and a lot of the work was done with seedlings in a greenhouse. So, okay. But yeah, it was more point rays based, as far as I know. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in the chat, Dan was asking, have you had a chance to study any of the unique fungi coming up after the CZU fire? And no, I haven't. I have not been in the coastal mountains at all since the CZU fire. I know that's an area that Christian Schwartz has been doing a lot of work in, and I'm really grateful for that. But you know, I'd like to get in there, but I haven't. Another question from Kenichi: Are snowmelt fungi any more closely related to taxa from wetter climates than fungi from the same areas that can fruit in drier times of year? Could they be relics of wetter times? And that's a very interesting question. This is something that let's talk about the hygrophorus for a minute. So hygrophorus gettii, I'm not sure what its closest relatives within hygrophorus are, but hygrophorus marziolus, the thing that we call hygrophorus marziolus in California, I definitely assume is fairly closely related to the true hygrophorus marziolus of Europe, which its name implies March fruiting time. So it's an early fruiter in Europe in early spring. So in that case, there probably is some credence to that the close relatives that are scattered around the Northern Hemisphere have kind of similar fruiting times. And yeah, there's a lot to think about what that means evolutionarily speaking. I am afraid that a lot of the snowbank fungi are on their way out, just because we don't have the conditions to support them anymore, to support them reliably enough for them to fruit. And so yeah, they are probably relics from a wetter time on one level, all of them, unfortunately. But that'll be interesting to see how they persist if their plant hosts persist, but the snowpack isn't there. You know, how are they going to be there if we look at root tip samples and just fruiting less and less frequently? What's that going to do to their genetic diversity? You know, how long, you know, if the plant hosts can survive without such a snowpack, will the fungi be there, or will they die out if they can't fruit? You know, I don't know. There's a lot to unpack, a lot to think about. A question from Shane. What is the likelihood that there are fungal species which only fruit the edges of melting snowbanks and high elevation forests that have recently burned? Yes, very probably. We just have to get there to be able to do the research. So Shane, you're on. Let's get out there to those high elevation burn sites as the snow is melting.